Just to introduce Danny. Danny's the author of a number of books, economic geographer, based at the University of Oxford, who has been well known for his work on inequality, social inequality, and the general state of society in Britain, which I think probably most of the people here have known because they might have one or two questions about how it's working at the moment. We're going to get straight into things and have a discussion here about some of the work that Danny's been producing. I'm going to read from a sheet of paper.
Sorry, guys. Yeah.
So I'm going to start with this question about 7 children. Could you start, Danny, by explaining why you wrote 7 children? What kind of audience you're aiming for, what myths or misconceptions you were hoping to correct, and what your overall argument was?
Okay. What I mainly do now is I write books. And I write books because if you're an academic, you either get to write papers or books, but if you write papers, somebody gets to referee them, and if you're interested, they say, no, you can't publish them. Books, you're allowed to actually say what you want to say in them much more. 7 Children is a book about 7 children born in the year 2018. They're 7 years old now, they're at school. They're not real, or in a way they are real, but they don't actually exist. They're made up from government statistics, so they're completely representative of the population of the UK of children. What I did was take all 14 million children alive at the time and sort them by how much money their mum and dad had into 7 groups of 2 million and took the middle one. So it's trying to tell you who it is you're teaching if you were to be teaching in an average school. And maybe the simplest way to explain what it shows, the UK is now the most unequal country in Europe, give or take Bulgaria. What that means is that 7 typical children have lives which are more different to each other than has been the case since the 1930s. You can go from the poorest child to the richest and see that the richest has as much, their family have as much to spend each week as the bottom 3. What you may not realise is that the parents of the richest child will have jobs that pay them the same as a couple of secondary school teachers. So, for those of you who are secondary school teachers, you're fairly young, but in about 10 years' time, if you have a kid, that child will be better off than 6 out of 7 other children. And you won't feel better off. You know, your union will be arguing that you need your wages increased and your conditions made better. But the people you're teaching are mainly worse off than you. So an incredibly unequal country. You might think, how is this possible? How can I be the posh one? Because above the top child are another 1 million children and their families. And they're taking 1/3 of everything. So, and they are the university professors like me, the doctors, the hospital consultants, the bankers, the very successful businesses. They only have 1 million children, but their children are spending 1/3 of everything, or they are, leaving only 2/3 to the rest, which is really unevenly distributed. Now, statistics are really boring. I'm probably sending you to sleep already. So, the way to try to explain this is to actually describe a typical day in children's lives and their families' lives, and what happens, what it feels like, as far as I can imagine it. That's a short version.
Thank you.
Slightly linked then, because I was thinking of your book, In the Next Crisis. You show how. Oh, sorry, I've got to use this. Hello, howdy. In The Next Crisis, you show how inequality affects people across their whole lives, and as educators, we see this every day in the classroom from the very start of a child's life. So from your research, where is the single biggest leverage point to break that cycle?
Okay.
Sorry about that.
No. In a way, I think some things are very simple. In university academics, we tend to say it's all very complicated. Otherwise, why do you need thousands of us, and why do you have to write so much? All the countries of Europe were incredibly unequal about 100 years ago. They all became dramatically more equal. It's almost exactly the same time, around the time of the First World War. there are numerous things going on. You know, the revolution in Russia, trade unions, more strikes in the 1920s, 10 times as many strikes in the 1920s and in the 1970s, which is 10 times as many as now. But the biggest thing was simply taking money off the rich. And what happened, and happened across Europe, is the First World War cost so much because it went on for so long and it wasn't planned to happen, that governments needed to pay back the money they borrowed to have that war and just to survive. And so they brought in inheritance tax and took the big houses off the rich. That ends up getting rid of giant houses and servants, to the point where we have almost no servants by the 1960s. But it destroyed the power of very rich families to control society. It wasn't planned. You know, nobody said, let's bang in inheritance tax and we have a kind of revolution. But it occurred. So simply removing the power and money of the very richest in a particular way, which will have to be different each time, that's what worked best the last time, until the very rich worked out another way of holding money and a way of avoiding inheritance tax.
I'm quite interested by some of the things you just said. Maybe we could leave the questions aside for a moment, or actually kind of skipping on to the third question that I was going to ask you, but now that you've raised it, the way that you described that, it sounds fortuitous that that the power of the rich was temporarily kind of disrupted and broken and it's been regained. Obviously, we're talking as a trade union audience, and we're talking about the union, and one of the major kind of motivating things for many trade union activists, if not rank and file trade union members necessarily, is how do we do that again? And the question, I suppose, would be, what do you think the NEU's policy should be? What should we be pursuing? How can we do that as a trade union movement? Or are you implying that it's going to take far more than that?
It has tended, so in the past, single unions, or even all the unions working together, have very rarely created a huge change. I mean, the general strike was lost in 1926. You can look back and say that it had an effect of making governments fear a general strike again, if it could occur. What unions, I think, did most usefully is keep things moving forward once they began to move forward. So demand that wages actually rose so people could come out of poverty who were in work. Demand that hours are reduced so that you can actually have a life. But it was done on an upswing. So it's worth thinking. There's a terrible tendency to get depressed if you're left-wing and progressive and think that nothing's going to get better. It tends to have got better when something has happened that wasn't necessarily planned, which creates a disaster, and then you use progressive politics to make sure you move it in the right direction. You don't have to think you have to do it all yourselves. There are also many things which have got much better over time and we tend not to notice. So teaching as a profession is much more progressive than it was when I was at school, over what the attitudes of teachers on average might have been, the politics of the union and so on. I mean, when I was at school, it was legal to beat children. So teachers actually beat children. Okay? I mean, you forget the achievements that are made and done. But thinking you can just do it yourself as a union, say as the miners fought in 1984, we can take this on with a few other unions helping us and fight Margaret Thatcher, that didn't work. It's when a whole set of circumstances come together. If you want really nice examples, Nordic countries always given, so I should give Nordic countries, where the unions helped countries like Finland become much more equal, which were incredibly unequal 100 years ago. Finland had a civil war in 1918. The unions have power within government. Or in Germany, where union members sit on boards of companies. And that position has been negotiated and just seen as absolutely normal. So it's not on your own. And don't think that things will always carry on the way they are, because we get a series of crises. In the recent ones, we haven't taken huge opportunity of them. You know, the banking crisis of 2008, or Brexit, or the pandemic. But there are little things. I was watching my email inbox today. This is just anecdote. And it was really quiet. Because I think quietly we've worked out, and I know you have to work on Fridays. There's a lot of people who work at home on Fridays. Okay? We're heading towards a three-day weekend. And we can do that with the help of unions to make it official, or just quietly agree with each other. Don't send any colleague an email on Friday. I mean, nobody wants to do anything on a Friday. They're not going to do it well. Wait till Monday. Unions got us a 2-week weekend. They can help us get the 3-day weekend. But don't think that things don't get better over time. We tend not to notice that they do, which is partly why we agitate and want more.
Thank you. What's quite big at the moment is obviously there's a lot going on in the world, especially a lot in the UK, and even as a teacher, you know, we're watching news round and having just important discussions about what is going on and how the children are feeling. And it kind of links to what you wrote about. So one of the key arguments in the next crisis was around how fears are distributed differently across society. Immigration and unemployment fears are often weaponised in politics. You see it everywhere at the moment. From your research, how do we challenge those myths whilst also addressing people's genuine insecurities about work?
Yeah, so Next Crisis was a book I did last year, with the help of Karen, who's here, so I should say, which is looking at international opinion polls of what people are most concerned about. And it's fascinating because the more affluent you are, the more likely you're to be concerned about different things. If you're affluent, climate is likely to be number one, the climate crisis. And that's pretty affluent. If you're middle class, working class, it's cost of living, poverty, inequality, all together. Absolutely number one. Because how on earth do I get through to the end of the week? And that's for the majority of people. And that was near to number one in the past. 10 years ago, number one was unemployment. Unemployment is still the second biggest concern in the world and in Britain. Not that we've got a huge number of people unemployed, it's that huge number of people are absolutely fearful of being made unemployed, and what the consequence will be, or you lot, for the young people at the front, actually really worried about who on earth is going to want me in 5 or 10 years' time. So fears really differ by situations. You could easily think, why on earth do people worry about that? The immigration worry, which, well, we've had 100 years of stoking this one up. You know, the British Union are fascists and so on and on and on. It's amazing that we haven't quite yet learned. It's too long this has been used and it's too obviously stupid. That's all I say now about immigration as a worry. You are really lucky if you live in a place that people are coming to. I was on Stoke-on-Trent Wednesday night. I'll say kind of fairly goofy that, you know, the one thing, well, there's two things going for Stoke at the moment. One is immigration, which means at least there are people coming. If you look at the schools in Stoke and who's actually there, if it wasn't for the immigrants, they would be dying. And we have had places that almost die because nobody comes. And the other thing, sadly, is Bet365, which is our biggest, most profitable gambling company. Which, you know, at least it's work, but it's, you know, it's not far off, you know, selling something that's highly deadly to people in some ways. When people come to an area, they create more jobs by coming there. They don't get rid of jobs. They don't get rid of houses. They build them. It's when people don't come that you've got to demolish tower blocks and terraces and you can't staff your health service. You find it quite hard to actually fund the power grid because it was built for a city that was much bigger in the past. So I think it should be said very plainly. I don't have much tolerance for people who say oh, you need to understand the fears of certain groups about immigrants. Just no. We've managed to almost orchestrate it, get people really scared. And the kind of way to do that, well, apart from huge numbers of headlines, people are going to look back and go, can you believe that they talked about small boats for that many years? Lots and lots of headlines. And then housing people in some of the worst parts of the poorest towns, and then saying that they can't do any work, so they've got to hang around. I mean, if you were trying, I don't honestly think it was a conspiracy to create well-organized, but it's stupid. We've taken the smallest number, I'm talking about refugees now, of any large country in Europe, and managed to do so in such a way as to create fear across the society. Germany took 1.5 million Syrians, half of them children, integrated. Poland took 1 million from Ukraine, all sleeping in a bedroom. And at the same time as creating this national fear about refugees, we do Brexit, and then luckily for us, end up with 500,000 people coming in a year. I mean, we're kind of cock-up country. There's not a problem that 500,000 are coming. You would see, if it wasn't for people coming, you would see parts of northern towns in particular being demolished. I'm only saying this because that's what I saw when I used to live in northern towns. I spent most of my life living in the north. My little boy is now 24. Knows that tower blocks go bang because I used to take him to see so many being blown up when they were being removed because they were apparently not needed. And only because of immigration are we not in that situation anymore. Only because of immigration can we keep a health service running, can we keep our education system running, can we actually run our universities, can we build houses. The one thing that people often don't understand is that you have to go back to the 1960s to find a time when people are having just over 2 children each. There's absolutely no way we're going to ever return to that. The whole of Europe is never going to be anywhere like that. It's 1.3. The only way the continent we're on keeps going is immigration. Finland's second city last year celebrated its highest ever population. Finland has a fertility rate of 1.3 children per couple. So they held a celebration and said thank you to the immigrants coming to the second city. I mean, it's actually still growing in size. But I think we should simply not tolerate this anymore because it's been going on too long. I'm happy not tolerate this idea of saying, don't you realise that there's a problem, this is affecting certain communities. I partly say this because I live in a city of immigrants. I was born in Oxford, I work in Oxford. Hardly anybody who works and lives in Oxford, very few were born in the city anymore. We've been socially cleansed, largely by white immigrants, middle class from other parts of the country. But if you want to know what it feels like to completely lose your community, I can tell you. And it is annoying that if you're local you can't afford to stay and the children can never stay. But it's not so annoying you become racist about it. Anyway, sorry.
That was great. That was great.
I think that's
Thank you.
very refreshing to hear a bit more of a straightforward answer than the ones we often hear, basically in any media except when you talk to a normal human being outside of outside the TV. I think that kind of leads on to the question that I was going to finish with, which I think we're just about time for, which was about the vehicles for social change. It does overlap a little bit with what I asked before, but I think that bringing up the question about immigration puts a new angle on it, because one of the big issues that we have in this country is that there is very little challenge to the political narratives of the right. And we have at the moment where Zach Polanski's recently been elected as the leader of the Green Party, Jeremy Corbyn and Zara Sultana are trying to start a new political party, and so previously you were a supporter of a lot of Jeremy Corbyn's economic policies, and I guess the question is about what is the vehicle that the trade union movement could be supportive of, a part of, or individual members of the trade union movement should be kind of embracing, or if not necessarily the vehicle, but what are the policies that you would hope to see major parties putting across?
Yeah. Trade unions need to be careful. We need to remember the history that they weren't always progressive, and they aren't.
Yeah.
So the trade union that was the largest union in the car plant in Oxford instigated with the bosses a colour bar, so until the 1950s only white men were allowed to work in. So unions, at various points, we have unions involved in the arms industry that are very into why it's okay that we make weapons. So a key one for unions is just because you're a union doesn't mean you're holier than thou, which you know, but it's worth saying. Particularly at a point, I'm a union member, when union members tend to be from better paid occupations, not from lower ones. Over progressive, I think we've got to get away from defending it and just call it normal. So in 2014, the Conservative Party left the European Conservative bloc, the European People's Party, and joined an alliance with Alternative for Europe, which is far right, and our Conservative Party became far right in 2014. It then moved further and further and further to the right, under Johnson and then under Truss, and even Sunak was one of the authors of far right books. Not a Conservative Party, it's not a European Conservative Party anymore. Reform are to the far right of the European far right, which is why the American billionaires like them so much. And the fact that the American billionaires like Reform so much you tell. Labour moved to where the normal position for a European Conservative Party is. To the right of Merkel, right to the right of a Christian Democrat German Conservative over what Labour will do. A left party, and a decent European country has a left party, they all have one. It's only because we've got first past the post that we haven't managed to get one, and we're finally getting one. Our left party, I'm sorry if I'm going to annoy members, will probably on this for a time be the least progressive left party in Europe, and it will be called far left. And actually it's probably going to look to somebody from the mainland like a slightly boring social democratic party. It'll feel radical in Britain. The Greens, it's not hard to look radical. When the Greens came out this week with, we want to largely get rid of private landlords, that can look radical because we have allowed the growth of private landlords since the 80s when we changed the law. There were hardly any private landlords before the 80s. The only people who had private landlords were university students in slum housing and very rich professionals. Otherwise it wasn't worth being a private landlord. When I was a child, all children had security of tenure. So your parents either had a mortgage or they were renting from the council. As long as you paid your rent or your mortgage, you could stay in your house, you go to school, you keep your friends. Currently, more than a quarter of children in England, their families are private renting, the most expensive way of housing, the least secure way. So this policy from the Greens, which is labelled as, this is radical, it's only a policy to go back to when we were more equal, or to instigate what many European countries already have, where what is in their private rented sector is so regulated it is essentially social housing. You can't evict your tenants, and you can't increase the rent, because of course that's a way of evicting them. It's great that the Greens have moved this jump. They're a small party, but as of this week I think they're on 15% in the polls. Labour and Tories are both on 17. Reform are on 34. Scary. But very unlikely, but not impossible. You could have a Green Reform as the top two in the polls. In Wales, Clyde may well be overtaking Labour as the major party of support. In Scotland, it's the Nationalists and has been. Maybe not been bad. So our politics is changing rapidly. And in a way, nobody would have predicted 10 years ago. My preference is that Labour gets some soul back again and actually starts to compete with the Greens. Or even, although perhaps it won't happen. But if the Tories really wanted to come back, a little bit of John Major One Nation conservatism would be to the left of Starmer at the moment. Now, it probably wouldn't work, but It's very, very strange and unpredictable times. The most dangerous thing that's going on is an assumption that there's a cap to reform support, which is why reform are not being shot down more. You can hear a nervousness. If any of you listen to the Today programme on Radio 4, which is the Bible of the upper middle classes, right? If you really want to understand this country, listen at 6 o'clock when you get the business news. Because at 6 o'clock they tell you what really matters, which is money. And then from 7 onwards it's politics. Today, Radio 4 announcers are just beginning to get scared about reform and putting Farage on. They put it on for clickbait, but their position, the existence of the BBC, is in doubt if reform wins. The dangerous thing that's going on, I think, and this is a theory some people have, is that the strategists for Labour would quite like reform to do really well, so that when it comes to a general election, in whatever, 2029, you're basically going to have to vote for Labour, otherwise you're going to get a reform government. And that's how they want to compete with your party, the Liberals, the Greens. Try to get it so you can't vote for them. You're going to have to vote for it. Can you imagine what Starmer's... Sorry, didn't you mean? You know, imagine what kind of grade Keir Starmer will be by that point. And you'll have to vote for the kind of grade Keir Starmer, because he'll promise to get rid of the two-child cap, which they've never managed to get rid of if you vote Labour. And the danger is that that is seen as a sensible policy. And it's dangerous. It's dangerous to assume that there is a cap on potential support for reform, especially given the amount of American money that there is behind reform, and that we are the real target. So the billionaires, 5 of them stood behind Trump when he was inaugurated, and they're the one group who are getting more money. The rich beneath billionaires and multimillionaires aren't doing this too well, the group who used to support Margaret Thatcher. The billionaires were bowled over by their victory in getting Trump in. Trump talks about wanting to take Mexico, wanting to make Canada the 50-whatever state, and wanting Greenland. Now, Greenland's got a few rare earth metals, but that's not what they want. What they want is their second or third home, which is London, or more generally what they call England. Right? They want that. You can see it in the money flooding into certain think tanks. You can see it in the interest from Elon Musk about, oh, can we get rid of Nigel Farage and get a more charismatic and slightly younger person leading reform? And that has to be seen as a danger, that the UK, in effect, is taken by an overseas country for the idea of spreading the gospel that huge inequality is good for the planet, and we need another country that's going to have a mission about how do we get to Mars, and all that kind of madness. It sounds ridiculous, but as yet we haven't done enough to actually protect from clever funding for the far right from American billionaires. If you want a danger, that's a danger. It's certainly a danger to trade unions, because a reform government wouldn't want there to be trade unions. You know, it's not only getting rid of settled status or getting rid of the Human Rights Act. Why would reform not abolish the right to actually meet? And reinstigate sending you to Australia if you did? It sounds ridiculous, but look at the trajectory. Don't get too frightened, but just don't be complacent. Oh, there'll just be another bunch of far-right Tories. That isn't who they are.
No. That's actually...
Yeah, sorry.
It's quite scary stuff, but it's true, it's accurate, and that's what we need to be thinking about. I'm not going to go and tell my Year 5 children currently.
No.
But thank you. I think me and John could ask questions, but I enjoy listening. I can see everyone else really enjoying listening. We want to, get you guys to ask some questions though as well. That's why you're here to ask some questions. So put some time in so you can ask some questions. So how we're going to do this is, I think, 2 questions or 2, 3 at a time, if that's all right for you to answer. 2.
I can remember 2.
Yeah, I was like looking. I was like, I don't see any pens or anything. So 2. If we do 2 at a time, if that's okay, and then we'll hand back to Danny to answer it. So, anyone want to ask anything? Anyone want to Don't be shy now, guys. That's all right. The screen, yes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's all.
Hi, Sarah. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for coming. First of all, that was really interesting. I've just got a very quick question, just more about the culture, particularly for working class kids. Because I think I think as educators, we do have quite high aspirations. I think it's in our nature to be altruistic and kind of want to fix the world, otherwise a lot of us and sort of do it again. So I guess the question is, us as the trade union movement, the trade union of teachers, how far can we kind of like change this mentality of kind of like working class jobs per se being something valuable again? Because I feel like, particularly with Academy States, particularly since Thatcher, it's been less about community and like certain jobs being of value, and more about like opportunity and aspiration. But a lot of that is, it translates to you get the scraps, you get the scholarships, you get this, that. It's very anti-working class, I think, like when you actually break it down. So I'm just wondering, how do we kind of like marry that culture and that sort of community attitude as a trade union of teachers?
Yeah, well, how we begin, we lost something, which other countries have. That's really, I'm a geographer, so I got about this, but when people say it's not possible, the sense of civil responsibility and caring for people's neighbours in other countries in Europe is generally much higher. A little bit because they're the same people who speak the weird language that you do and nobody else does. But mainly because in most European countries people went to the nearest school and they know each other. Whereas we're not just the most segregated country in Europe by education. No other European country spends 30% of its money on just 7% of kids. All segregates its state schools in the way that we do by house prices. And that's destroyed. Idea of solidarity and community. Most people in most towns do not know the other half of their town, whereas they would have done in the 60s and 70s because the gap was less. You have to get the wages being decent. And you can do it through minimum wages at first. But pushing them up more and more so that no job pays as little as some of our jobs do now. The only way you can afford that is not increasing wages at the top, which unions don't tend to like. I'll never forget going to TUC when the union that represented airline pilots were celebrating the fact that the Qantas pilots who fly to Australia had managed to get their salary to $250,000 a year. And the head of the union went, they're the vanguard of the working class. And I was thinking, they don't really need $250,000. It's not that hard a job being in a cockpit. In the 30s, when we were becoming more and more equal, the salaries of people at the top stayed flat or went down slightly. People ran building societies and so on. So you've got to do that. And you can see examples of it happening. Scotland is my favourite example. In Scotland they have higher income tax for higher earners, which is hospital consultants, professors, and so a few people in business. Most people in business don't make that much money, just a tiny number do. Most people in business are they've got a white van, they're running a small company, or a plumber. But you can't have high incomes at the top, otherwise the gap becomes too big. Scotland are raising more income tax than people at the top, so they're not as separated. And in Scotland, they pay a Scottish child payment so that a family of 3 children who are on benefit, which is Chat 7 in Scotland, get an extra £4,000 a year untapered. Everybody can feed their kids, nobody goes cold in winter. Right? This is happening in Scotland, and it's the beginnings of it. But you go to more progressive European countries, it's not just the 5 Scandinavian countries, they're Finland, Sweden, Norway, Iceland and Denmark. There are another 5 which are more progressive than those now are income inequalities, which is Belgium. And there are 5 which are almost as equal as the Nordics. And those 5 which are almost as equal include France and Germany. So there are 15 countries in Europe which are staggeringly equitable. And that means that Their university professors are paid less. They're less likely to live separately. Their children go to the same schools as everybody else who works in the building. And it stops you not seeing other people like you. And you can see it. 20 years ago, I visited two professors in Bern in Switzerland, and they had a cleaner, right? They had a cleaner because they're both professors. The cleaner was on €30 an hour because that was the going rate. And Switzerland is not an amazingly progressive country. We are extremely weird. I promise any other answers will be short, but one way to be really optimistic about our situation is that when you are so bad, almost by default, by chance, you end up not being as bad. It takes a lot of effort to make this country as bad as it is. It does. It's a lot of people buying newspapers, because our press is one of the worst in Europe apart from Italy. A lot of people buying newspapers and telling their journalists they've got to write things that are wrong. A lot of political funding. You should see the funding for the Tory party. Right? It's a lot of hard work. Education. It's really expensive to have as many schools as we have. Last thing I'll say about Oxford, we have more private schools in Oxford and far more land that's private than state schools. We've got one school with a 9-hole golf course within the ring road that's private. We have more teachers working in private schools and other staff than state schools, even though 2/3 of kids go state. The resources that we put into education in the city of Oxford for children couldn't be more ineffectively distributed than they are. The outcome is terrible, in that the top state school in Oxford gets worse results, if you care about that, than 6 schools in Sheffield. The bottom school in Oxford is one of the very worst in the country for what happens there, and we kind of keep quiet about it because you don't want to damn it, but you know, it's not necessarily, I won't say if you work in schools, you know. The private schools, parents are paying for their children mostly to go to schools where they failed an entrance exam to get into the 2 posh ones. Imagine paying for your child to go to a secondary modern. And at the end result of all of this, in a city with only about 1,000 kids going state in a year, 500 going private, the children don't know each other because they don't mix, because that's what you're paying for. And still half of them go off to university, and mostly the same ones. So you're not getting anything for your money, really. You're certainly not necessarily getting less drug use from the expensive schools. You know, the idea that my child will be safe if I send him to a school where the parents can all actually afford cocaine. It's really, really annoying. But back to so if you're in a situation where you're spending so much on education, even though it's only £6,000 a child in a comprehensive, when you look at it that way, when you've given up so much land to it, that you're doing it so inefficiently, Oxford could have one senior leadership team, single SLT. You could keep the 6 state schools with their names, could each have a head, move teachers between them, make the city safe to cycle. It's only 10 minutes to cycle between them. The number of things you could do are unbelievable. And you can already see it in other places. The Finns came and looked what we were doing in the 60s and copied it. They just did it slightly better and they stuck to it, which is why they have some of the best schools in the world. So I laugh about our situation, and there are reasons why it's so bad. There's a hangover of empire and various things. But you shouldn't get depressed when we have enough buildings. You could do the same for hospitals, right? We have more hospitals and more doctors and nurses, but we have this huge private sector that 1 in 10 adults uses each year, which is often doing things that are not particularly necessary, but somebody's got the cash. There was a pandemic. All those private hospitals would have gone bust within weeks. What did the government do? It bailed them out. You know, we could have actually created a second national health service if we wanted. Right? There are all kinds of things that are theoretically possible. I know these won't actually happen overnight, but there was a point where the Conservatives nationalised further education. Did you know about that? It was done very quietly. FE was in such a terrible state, with such debts. I think it was Michael Gove did it quickly. ONS reclassified them as part, the Office of National Statistics, so that further education is now part of the state sector because the money's all coming from the state. Michael Gove, the Secretary of State for Education, sent a letter the next day to all heads of FE colleges saying you may no longer borrow any money, you're part of my department. What the letter didn't say, the implicit thing, but it didn't say it was, you're now part of the government department. So clearly you can't carry on paying yourself more than the Prime Minister to run the FE college. But we nationalise further education because we have to. We nationalise train lines, but only because we had to. Right? Don't ever think things aren't possible. It just would be better to plan to do it rather than to wait for the next disaster.
We've got enough time, definitely another round of questions, at least one.
Yeah.
Go on, stick your hands up now.
This is it. After this, we're done.
All right. I'm going to go with Julian, and I'm going to go with right over there. Yeah.
It's just a brief question. Before you said you don't think people took advantage of the pandemic to kind of push for change, I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on why people didn't do it, or any other small things that they could have used to push for change previously.
And should we do another one together?
Yes.
Yeah.
I wanted to, the next crisis is about what people worry about. I wanted to ask the three of you what the young people and children you know worry about, whether it's university students, primary school or secondary school, what they're worried about.
Thank you. Should we start? If you go for both questions.
And then you two do your answers, yeah. Well, the pandemic was a shock. I remember it really was quite a shock. And many governments simply wanted to get back to normal as fast as they could to do that. But they differed. I won't get into trouble. It's fascinating. We did an incredible international experiment about schools, by the way. And I think we're halfway through the 4 weeks of the COVID inquiry about schools at the moment. So we at least should learn from that. We're not going to get another coronavirus pandemic for about 100 years. But anyway. In some ways there have been huge changes. A very close friend of mine this morning calculated that for their part of the civil service, office occupancy is now at 10.9%. Now, people are supposed to be going in 2 days out of 5 a week in this part of the civil service. So they're clearly at half that. So we have learnt we can work at home. We've also learnt from surveys that younger people tend to prefer working at home more than older people. We assumed older people went, oh, this is terrible, they won't learn from our great wisdom by coming in. It actually turns out they're quite glad not to hear from us. So that change in behaviour, the fact that Thursday is now the new Friday in London, so I'm very grateful you've come out on a Friday. And that dramatically improves people's lives. The idea that doesn't affect teachers, you have to be in. But for many, many jobs, that's a huge change. It's a great pity because the way we unlocked, it's a great pity we didn't use it to stop international air travel going up and up again. Fears of people and university students. The level of mental ill health is off the scale. Quite a lot of it is still quite hidden, but just fears about almost everything. Particularly AI. Partly because students I've not yet met a student who's not using AI. They don't, I ask them quietly, go, yes, I am. And it's great if your English isn't your first language. It's actually quite nice as translating. The problem is that you very quickly go from using it for things like that to, well, just tell me how to do this dissertation. And then people are getting a fear that they won't be employed in future. And these are really affluent youngsters I'm talking about. And of course, if your education has been that all you've done is ask ChatGPT how to answer the questions, you're not really very employable, are you? So it's a rational fear. And I think we need to work out. It's irrational in that we've never had fewer younger people in world history. And we're going to get even fewer next year, and even fewer next year forever. And we've never had a more literate, educated, confident, in terms of political knowledge set of young people. The generation 2 above me, you left school at 14 and you went into the mill. And if you could read and write and do basic sums, you were clever. So most people thought that they couldn't have a political opinion. Partly didn't know what the word politics really meant. The good thing about having 63% of people going to university at age 30 is that it's quite hard, I think, to tell younger generations not to worry their little heads about things and to let the older people run it. But I do worry about the level of anxiety, the level of fear, and the level of trepidation, because those worries are very, very high, no matter how we measure them. The average older school student or younger university student in the USA today, if asked to do a psychological test on a scale used in the 1950s, would have been seen in the 1950s as at severe danger of severe mental ill health. And that's now your average American. This is all before Trump became president for the second time. Now, we're not as bad as the USA, but we're not good. And on the European scale of mental health, we're one of the worst because we're the most precarious future. Mental health is actually best in the Nordic countries, even though they worry about it greatly there. But the proportion of young adults suffering mental illness is lowest in the Nordic countries. Because you've got the most secure future. You know, if you decide to take a job, classic example is nursing, the amount of money you'll be paid to be a nurse is enough to live a good life. You don't have to worry about trying to get jobs in the top 10% as much. You don't have to worry about health service because it works. You don't have to worry about where you live because every school is good. And that makes people much happier with their lives and with themselves. Your go.
Okay. That's really interesting. If I think about primary school at the moment, and I'm particularly thinking about my class, there's two different kind of fears that we have. One is everything to do with the world at the moment. For them, they feel like it's sad, and a lot of children have spoken to me recently about death, and it's a constant thing, which, I think it's really important to have discussions, and we have discussions, of course, and for them to see the news, but some of them are fearful, and, we were all children. It's not nice to constantly hear that. Obviously, we want it's good to be realistic, but also they're children, and, I've had lots of talks recently with parents where, they're struggling to even walk past the pharmacy and stuff like that. The news, it triggers some of these children at the moment. And that's something that I didn't even think about, even Newsround, which I used to grow up watching Newsround. I don't know if anyone else did. But at the moment, Newsround, even though they try to make the news, child-friendly, it still scares our children what is going on at the moment. And that is a real fear and anxiety, that my children in my class, kid you not, in primary school, that's what we're going through. And the other thing, SATs. In my class, I teach year 5, and that's been going on for years. And it's SATs, it's their tests that they do, and they're next year in year 6, but they're worried. I've heard children say I'm depressed. That's a big word to use, but they're saying they feel depressed. I'm like, babes, if you're depressed now, wait till GCSEs. But that's not what we want, because SATs in reality doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't go anywhere. That doesn't, they have this fear, I won't get into the secondary school I want to. You will. It's all fine, but we start this off from young, and it's, as we know, it's for the schools. It's for the schools. My head teacher doesn't hear this, but it's for the schools and our children, because they have to just be children. But we've got all these different fears with them. So that's the fears I see in primary school at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I was thinking about it the whole time that when Shaniqua and Danny were speaking. I'm still not really sure what I think, because I think that I don't want to be completely uncritically like doom laden. It feels like there are a lot of things that are deeply wrong with our society and our world right now. Like, it feels difficult to talk about what to be worried about, because I feel like so much is horribly wrong. Like, what's happening in Palestine, the genocide, what's happening with the climate. And I feel like these things are also connected, because I think that we're seeing in the US the kind of the most, I mean, maybe it's also to do with how much I know about international politics, but I feel like what we're seeing in the US at the moment is the most advanced form of this new kind of society, which seems to be based on fear, racism, and hysteria around the possibility of letting in people who might be in danger anywhere else around the world. And as the world becomes more dangerous, then more societies, it feels like, will be built around this basic principle that any outsider has got to be excluded and is an existential threat to the society. We're all going to live in fortress countries. So I feel afraid for that kind of world to emerge, and I think that we really need to be thinking about how can we build a politics that has something beyond nationalism, something that's not just opposing nationalism, but has a different sense of what we are as people and how we reach beyond borders in order to build a better world rather than just better individual countries. So I feel that my worry is that is going to be very difficult to do, and I don't know how to do it, and I feel like it's extremely urgent, basically. Yeah.
So it's kind of jumping in, but it's just really made me think about something really hopeful to finish with. But there's this amazing study that Global Action Plan had done around perception gaps, and they got a group of young people together. It's mostly about the climate, but I think it can be applied to lots of things. And they asked them basically, do you think other people your age care about other people that care about the world? And the majority would say no. And in reality, they themselves said, I do care about other people, and it's that perception gap. And you see it in older generations as well. And I think we have an amazing role in classrooms, because we can open up those conversations and allow them to realise that the people around them do care much more than they think, and that they're something to make sure that actually, if they get together and realise that there's a shared, even just a shared fear, sometimes that opens the conversation. I just thought it was a nice that song, and we need to kind of get beyond that fear.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks. I'm going to go last of all here, and then everyone, there is going to be an opportunity to come and speak to Danny at the end, so, and to get books signed and things, so it's not the end of the discussion.
Yeah,
but
we just want to make time that you have, because we're going to go soon, so we want to make sure we have time.
I just want to say, I think to combat that fear, what we have to think of is, at a union level, getting together with people. But I think we had the Thatcher individualism, which has really seeped into our society, like you would say, the lack of community. But I think, one of the things that unions do is bring people together. I mean, like, you're all here tonight, you youngsters coming here tonight, which is absolutely great. Coming together makes you feel better. And a union does that, but also getting active in your community does that. So I'm actually from Portsmouth, not from London, but we've been having the far right turning up every Friday. And we have had people turning up week after week, and we've all got to know each other. And some of them I knew already, and sort of meeting them again after a few years. And what's been great is we've sort of been a collective. And I mean, that's what a union can do. But I think that's also what we have to do within children, within schools, sort of encouraging children to work together to do things, to work on projects together, to work on things in the class together, working for refugees together, for example. I think the union has got some lots of information out about how schools can help refugees, have little projects in the classroom. And I think all those things are ways that we can sort of bring people together to combat this individualism, combat this lack of community. Because I think when people feel they're doing things together, you come away feeling better. One of the people who came along to our protest, I hadn't met before, and we were discussing it in the chat, and she said, I come away feeling so pleased. I feel very happy because they've actually done something. You know, instead of feeling